So as thoughtful Christians, we cannot shy away from difficult challenges, and we can't balk at speaking the truth, even when it's unpopular. And today, we're going to look at what I believe is one of the most difficult challenges that Christians need to address. In fact, this challenge comes up with some frequency at events that I do, speaking events. It never fails. The Canaanites come up. It's difficult to address this topic for a number of reasons. First, there's no soundbite response to this question. I can't just say yes or no and then move on to the next question. In fact, we will spend all of our time in this session just dealing with this. Does the Bible condone genocide? And more time could be devoted to it. Second, my response may not be emotionally satisfying to some of you. There's something deeply disturbing about these accounts, and I can't just wave my apologist's magic wand and just make the challenge go away. Did you guys know that apologists have magic wands? It's really cool. And so, of course, just because my response may not be emotionally satisfying doesn't mean that it's not a reasonable response to this objection. One of the tactics of atheists and skeptics, especially the new atheists in particular, is to show a number of things. First, that science is on their side, and we actually looked at that gospel of science. They want to show that reason is on their side, and they want to show that morality is on their side. And one justification for an atheist claim to the moral high ground is the seemingly patently immoral behavior of the God of the Old Testament. And so maybe you've heard of Richard Dawkins, probably one of the most famous atheists in the world. And this is what he says about the God of the Old Testament in his book, The God Delusion. He says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, right? We're going to answer that. Filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Okay, Richard, why don't you tell us what you really think, right? And so that's quite a mouthful. Try to say that 5 times fast. Well, where does this come from? Why are some of these atheists making comments like this? What are some of the passages that they're referring to, this God of the Old Testament? Well, let's just do a quick Bible study. We'll just read a few passages together. In Deuteronomy, we read the instructions from God given to the people of Israel on how they will take possession of the promised land, okay? And this is what it says, Deuteronomy 7, 1 to 5. It says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clearing away many nations before you. Now this is important terminology, clearing away the nations before you. The Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the mosquito bites. No, they're not in there. They're not in there. 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. Some translations say utter destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. Then it says this, you shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons and taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. This is important, because he would destroy even the Israelites. But thus shall you deal with them. You shall break down their altars and dash to pieces their pillars and chop down their asherim and burn their carved images with fire. Here's another one. Skip over to Deuteronomy 20, where God lays out the laws concerning warfare. This is what he says. But in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, speaking about this promised land, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and the mosquito bites. As the Lord your God has commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. How about this one? Joshua 6:21. Thus says, do I have this on my notes? Then they devoted all in the city to destruction, all of them, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, with the edge of the sword. Sounds like they're wiping out everyone. How could God command such a thing? Does this mean that God is some kind of genocidal maniac? Is he a moral monster? That's the question. The goal of many, not all, but many atheists is not to actually understand Christianity, but rather to stockpile ammunition to use against it. And it is terribly easy to just quote one of these passages that we just looked at and then jump to the conclusion that God is immoral. Some of the toughest challenges arise because the challenger doesn't even attempt at understanding the text and its context. I would argue that this is one of those challenges, the killing of the Canaanites. In fact, the fact remains that the Bible records many events that should make us a little uncomfortable. Things like, how could God ask Abraham to sacrifice his firstborn son? Why does God seem to allow slavery in the Old Testament? Why are there some Bible passages that are difficult to reconcile? We actually looked at that. And perhaps one of the most confusing and uncomfortable events of all is the alleged genocide perpetrated by the Israelites against the Canaanites. Now, before we can even begin to answer this specific question, I actually have a question for my atheist friends. And so when this comes up, this is usually where I go first if the questioner is in fact an atheist. If there is no God, consider this, if there's no God, then why is any Old Testament atrocity wrong? Really? From an atheistic worldview, there is no objective moral foundation for judging the God of the Bible as evil. There is no evil unless there's a standard of good. But what objective standard of good is there on the atheist worldview? They simply don't have one. On the atheist worldview, there is no right, there is no wrong. There is there's no good and evil in an objective sense. All they're left with is moral subjectivism. Rather, it's often referred to as moral relativism. But if this is the case, then you can't judge what one culture did at one particular time by your standards, right? Because these are different cultures. They have different subjective, relativistic moralities. So the honest question here is, by what standard can an atheist call God's behavior evil? The atheist cannot say God has violated some objective moral law when, on his own view, no objective moral law actually exists. And don't take my word for it. This is what Richard Dawkins says. The same Dawkins that we opened with, okay? Consider this. He says, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we would expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, listen, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. See what he's saying there? There is no objective morality on his view. Philosopher of science Michael Roos, he completely agrees on this point. He wrote an article in The Guardian called God is Dead, Long Live Morality. He's also an atheist. He says, morality is just a matter of emotions, like liking ice cream and sex and hating toothache and marking student papers. He's a professor. But it is and has to be a funny kind of emotion. It has to pretend that it is not that at all. If we thought that morality was no more than liking or not liking spinach, then pretty quickly it would break down. Yeah, I guess so. So morality has to come across as something more than emotion. It has to appear to be objective, even though it's really subjective. Okay? What do I mean by subjective? What's a subjective morality? Well, subjective morality is completely determined by the subject. That's why they call it subjective. It's determined by the subject. It's based on the subject's likes and dislikes. Subjective truths are personal, private preference claims. The truth only depends on the subject, okay? Whatever's true for them. So you've heard this. That's true for me, but maybe not for you. Some people like strawberry ice cream. Some people don't. Some people like to kill people, and some people don't. You see how this works. There's nothing really wrong. There's nothing really evil on this view. And so an atheist who condemns the God of the Old Testament for commanding the killing of the Canaanites is like the person who condemns God for creating Brussels sprouts. You're thinking, what? Imagine an atheist says, I don't believe in God. I can't believe in God. And you say, why not? He says, Brussels sprouts. And you're like, okay, what's the problem with Brussels sprouts? Well, I can't believe in a God who would make something so distasteful to me. Right? This is the exact relativistic response. And so on atheism, right and wrong amount to personal taste. So for the killing of the Canaanites to be an objective wrong, an objective evil, then morality has to be objective, not subjective. But this is a problem, okay? Because if it's objective, then God must exist. C.S. Lewis, he makes this point beautifully in his book, Mere Christianity. He says this, because he was an atheist and became a Christian. He says, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice. That's relative morality, right? This is relativism. By saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own, but if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. You see where this goes? So if there's no God, it's just one culture determines and another culture, and no one can really say it another culture what they did was wrong. But most people recognize for there to be a universal, objective, moral law, there must be a moral lawgiver. I mean, that just makes sense. And our moral duties are given through his commands. However, if God does not exist, there's no objective moral standard, there's no objective moral laws, and then you're left with moral relativism. Now, I need to bring up one possible response. Some of you might be thinking, but Tim, I have these atheist neighbors at home, next door, at home, in the basement. No, I have them just locked up. I have these atheist neighbors next door, and they are good people. You know, they are really good people. They would never do anything like, murder someone or something like that. And this kind of comment just misunderstands my point, okay? Many will assert that they can know good and evil. They can know good and evil without believing in God. And that's actually true. Romans 2 says as much, okay? I think everybody knows right and wrong. Everybody knows good and evil, whether you believe in God or not. Okay, the moral law is written on our hearts. But it's not about knowing good and evil. It's about grounding good and evil. It's about grounding it. What is your standard? What is your grounding? It's kind of like this. I thought this might help. You can know what a book says while denying that there's an author, okay? We could deny that Dr. Seuss exists, and we can say, look I can read green eggs and ham, no problem. I don't need the author to define the words for me. I can read it just fine. But listen, there would be no book to read in the first place unless there was an author, correct? In the same way, likewise, atheists can know objective morality while denying God exists, but there would be no objective morality to even know unless God exists, okay? So you don't have to believe in him, but he must exist for there to be an objective morality. In the same way, the author must exist for there to be a book, even if you deny he exists while you're reading. Does that make sense? I hope so. So that's kind of a little illustration there. Now, I think the only legitimate way that an atheist can raise the apparent immoral behavior of God in the Old Testament is for him to make an internal critique of the Christian worldview from within, so to speak. And so he's got to leave his worldview, come into ours, okay? He could say something like this: given that you Christians believe in an all-good, all-loving God, why would God command the killing of the Canaanites? They could say that. Granted, okay, let's say God exists. You think he's all good. You think he's all loving. Well, what's up with all this stuff going on in the Old Testament? What's with the Canaanites being wiped out? So that, I think, is a valid argument. They're trying to show that there's an inconsistency in our worldview. Okay, but notice what they have to do to make that claim. They got to grant some of our worldview. So let's look at this. Let's look at this challenge. To better understand the killing of the Canaanites, we need to look at an event that took place 400 years prior to the killing of the Canaanites, okay? So we're going to actually go even further back. We're going to go back to a promise to Abram around 1800 BC. It's a promise to Abram, who later becomes Abraham. It's recorded in Genesis 12, 1-3. It says this: "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house," this is important, "to the land that I will show you. To the land I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and to him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Okay? If you go to Genesis 15, 18-21, it actually gives us more specifics about this land, more details about the land. "And on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river of Euphrates, and the land," and it goes on from there, all the way to the mosquito bites again. And so here we have this land promise. God promised that he's going to bless all the nations of the world through Abraham's descendants. Okay, Abraham, part of the promise from God includes a land, sometimes referred to as the promised land because it was the promised land. I'm not going too quick, right? And so now there is a problem. There's a problem here. Because the land that was promised to Abraham and his descendants was already inhabited by the Canaanites. Okay? We call them the Canaanites because they lived in Canaan. It's not too complicated. So at the time of the promise to Abraham, God wasn't ready just to hand over the land. He wasn't ready to do that to the Israelites just yet. And he actually tells us why. If you go to Genesis 15, just a couple of verses prior to what we just looked at, here's what he says. "Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. And he says this, but I will bring judgment on the nations they serve." Okay, now we're getting an indication of what's going on here. "I will bring judgments, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Okay, so God knows the Canaanites aren't just going to give up the land to the Israelites without a fight. Okay? God tells Abraham that he's going to wait 400 years to fulfill the promise that he made. Why? Because God wasn't ready to judge the Canaanites just yet. In essence, God was willing to give this extremely, and we're going to look at this in more detail, extremely sinful Canaanite culture 400 years to repent of their ways and turn to God. Of course, God knows that most are going to get more and more sinful as those 400 years continue. So in God's providence, and this is cool, he uses the judgment of the Canaanites to secure the promised land for the descendants of Abraham. Okay? Don't miss this. The time of the fulfillment of the land promise converges with the time when God is going to finally execute judgment on the Canaanites. So these two things are coming together and coincide. So at this point, God hasn't said how he's going to judge the Canaanites, only that he's going to judge them. And that this judgment is going to coincide with the possession of the promised land. Now, this point, it may be natural to ask, why were the Canaanites going to be judged by God? Why were they going to be judged by God? What was so bad about these people that they deserved God's wrath, that they deserved to be kicked out of their inhabited land? Well, the Canaanite people were deeply, deeply depraved. They engaged in things like idolatry, incest, temple prostitution, adultery, homosexuality, bestiality, child sacrifice, witchcraft, sorcery. I mean, the list goes on and on. But just for example, the Canaanites worshipped the underworld god Molech. Okay? Molech, you can see the sketch on the screen, represented by an upright, bull-headed brass idol with a human body. What they would do is they would stoke a fire essentially in his belly so that he would go into the hundreds, even thousands of degrees until his arms were literally glowing hot, and then they would place their children in Molech's arms, and they'd essentially watch their children be burned to death. So this was a deeply depraved culture. If they were alive today, if this kind of thing was going on today, I mean, I think these guys make ISIS look like, Barney and Friends. But even ISIS, we think, is deeply depraved, and we want someone to go in and do something about them. And so Canaanites are not, they were known, in fact, for sacrificing their kids up to the age of 4 years old. Can you think of anything more heinous? I can't. Can you see why God wanted to judge these people? I hope so. These were not an innocent group of bystanders that were just getting in the way of the Israelites getting their promise. No, it wasn't like that. The conquest of the land of Canaan is portrayed as an act of judgment of a very, very wicked society. Now, what happened to the Canaanites is often referred to as a genocide. So we have to define our terms here. Sometimes it's called an ethnic cleansing. But let's define what these words actually mean. A genocide is a deliberate killing of a people who belong to a particular ethnic, racial, political, or cultural group. Okay? That's essentially why they're being killed. Similarly, an ethnic cleansing is the practice of, you guys can still hear me? The practice, did this kick out? The practice of removing or killing people. I can yell. The whole thing? Yeah. I'll just keep going. People who belong to an ethnic group. Again, it has to do with one ruling group who suppresses and kills a group based on their ethnicity. So, I mean, we in our lifetime have seen this kind of thing happen. The Nazi Holocaust was a genocide. Human beings were being killed because they were Jewish. It's happening today. It was just months ago where they finally called what was going on with ISIS and Christians a genocide. Again, they're killing Christians because they're Christians. However, the Canaanites were killed because of their wickedness, not because of their ethnicity. This was a judgment, not a genocide. This was judgment, not a genocide. Philosopher Paul Copan, he wrote a book, it's really good. It's called Is God a Moral Monster? And he actually devotes 3 different chapters to this question. Thank you. He devotes 3 chapters to this question. Let me just talk amongst yourselves. All right. On. Can you hear me now? Yes. Sweet. And this is what he says. This is what he says. God was concerned with sin, not ethnicity. In fact, as we read the Old Testament prophets, they, with God, were angered about Israel's disobedience. So it's not just the Canaanites, angry with Israel. And they threatened divine judgment on Israel, Judah, more often than they did against the pagan nations. Simply put, God killed the Canaanites because of their sin, not their ethnicity. God commanded an act of judgment on guilty, wicked people. This is completely different than what we just saw with the Nazis and with what's going on with ISIS and Christians, okay? What is Paul Copan saying? He's saying this: God wasn't playing favorites. Israel wasn't intrinsically morally superior. They weren't better in any way like that. In fact, Israel would go on to suffer they would suffer the same fate as the Canaanites for committing very similar sins against God. Okay? And so God actually warns the Israelites about this. And here's a key text. Of all the texts we'll look at, I think this one is really important to kind of putting this whole thing in perspective. This is what Deuteronomy 9, 4, and 5 says. Do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has, and notice the terminology, thrust them out before you. It is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land, whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. Again, driving them out. Not because of your righteousness or your uprightness of your hearts are you going to possess their land, but because of, and this is important, the wickedness of the nations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you, and that you may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And so here it's explicit. They're being judged because of the wickedness, their wickedness. It's not because the Israelites were any better. And so rather than calling this a genocide, somebody put it, I thought it was clever, this is more like a sinicide, okay? This is a sinicide. This is deliberate killing of sinful people who have sinned against God. He's trying to wipe out the sin that's going on in this nation. The Canaanite conquests were not motivated by ethnicity, not hatred of a group of people. It was motivated by judgment of sin. And those who repented, by the way, were spared. The first Canaanite we meet in the conquest of Canaan, do you know what it was? It was actually Rahab, okay? And when Rahab puts her faith in God, she is spared. Not just her whole family. If it was just about wiping out an ethnic group, then she wouldn't have been spared. And this is what many who raise the challenge fail to understand. God is just, but he's also merciful. He's also merciful. I talk to a lot of young people, and I would say that most are under the impression that there's 2 gods. There's this God of the Old Testament, and then there's a God of the New Testament, and they're different. They think that the Old Testament God, he's the God concerned with justice and punishing sinners. But somewhere between the Old Testament and the New Testament, God got an attitude adjustment. And he goes from a God of justice and wrath to a God of love and forgiveness and mercy and grace. And if that's your view, I've talked to even adults who believe that. If that's your view, Well, I can only conclude that you haven't read the Bible, okay? You just haven't read the Bible. Why? Because the Old Testament is full of examples of God's love and mercy and grace, and the New Testament spends a good portion of space devoted to talking about things like hell, God's wrath, and final judgment. We read the book of Revelation. And so there isn't these two gods. There is one God from cover to cover. Consider this. Before God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah for their sin, Abraham begins kind of a negotiation that goes on. And he says this, suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? And the Lord said, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. And then they keep going. You guys know the story. And they go. He gets them down to 10, right? He admits, 10, I will spare the entire city, this wicked city, for 10 righteous people. Imagine the city of Newmarket. I'll spare it for 10 righteous people. Does that sound like a moral monster to you? To me, that sounds like a God of mercy, sparing all of these wicked people for just 10 righteous. And how about this? How about the story of Jonah? Read the story of Jonah tonight. It's 4 chapters, okay? Jonah is a prophet of God. He's directed by God to go to the city of Nineveh to deliver a message of repentance. And like the Canaanites, the Ninevites were extremely wicked people, also engaging in gross sin that we've already looked at, and some even worse. They deserve to be utterly destroyed by God, really. So rather than listen to God, Jonah, you guys know where he goes? He decides to hop on a boat, head in the opposite direction. We're told that he hopped on a ship at Joppa and headed to Tarshish. The sailors of the ship became concerned because there was a great storm that started to brew, and Jonah explained, well, this is God actually bringing judgment on me. So what'd they do? They took him and they threw him overboard into the sea. He's swallowed by a great fish. In fact, Jonah 1:17 says, and the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the stomach of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Now after these 3 days, the fish coughed Jonah up, and Jonah obeyed God and went to Nineveh to fulfill his mission. Now, so Jonah, he walks over to Nineveh. Now, Jonah preached the message of repentance, and to his surprise, the city, this sinful city, actually repents. They actually repent. Jonah 3, verse 5 says, and the people of Nineveh believed in God, and they called a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest to the least of them. Now, was Jonah happy about this, or was he pretty ticked off? Yeah, he was not happy. This is where we find out why Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh in the first place. It says, and this is Jonah chapter 4, but it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. And he prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew, listen to this, I knew that you were a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. Now listen, I find this a little ironic, that Jonah's complaint about the God of the Old Testament is the exact opposite complaint of the new atheists, right? You guys remember we started with Richard Dawkins. And Dawkins had a lot to say about the God of the Old Testament. He said he was arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction, right? But what do you think Jonah would say? Here's what I think Jonah would say. I quoted a little bit from Jonah and expand a little bit. I think Jonah would say this: the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most pleasant character in all of nonfiction. Gracious and merciful, A gentle, just, forgiving God, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster, taking no pleasure in the death of the wicked, not wishing that any should perish, but that all would come to repentance. See, Jonah's problem with God was the exact opposite problem that Dawkins cites. How can Dawkins and Jonah come to seemingly opposite conclusions? While I think the problem stems from the human heart. The heart is the problem for both of these men, and I think Professor Clay Jones at Biola, hits this right on the head here. He says, most of our problems regarding God's ordering the destruction of the Canaanites comes from the fact that God hates sin, but we don't. And I think that says a lot. In fact, he goes on to say this: we do not appreciate the depth of our own depravity, the horror of sin, and the righteousness of God. Consequently, it is no surprise that when we see God's judgment upon those who commit the sins that we commit, that complaint and protest arises within our hearts. So in a certain sense, the lesson of the conquest is a simple one. God punishes evil. For many in our culture, though, the Canaanite offenses simply are not that offensive, right? Divination, sexual adventure, adultery, homosexuality, and so on, are they really that evil? That's what our culture would ask. And I think God would say, yes, absolutely. He abhors those things. Virtually every crime on the Canaanites' rap sheet is common fare in our communities and can be found literally with a click away on the internet. Children aren't being torched on an altar of Molech, but they're being killed by the thousands daily in abortion clinics, sacrificed to the gods of choice and convenience. Now, I want to make another observation. Despite the horrors of the Canaanites that they were committing, many atheists complain that God was immoral in opposing them, right? He's a genocidal monster is what they've called him. Yet, the most common challenge raised against the existence of God is the problem of evil. It's the problem of evil. If God exists, why is there so much evil in the world? Why doesn't God do something about it? Why doesn't God intervene? That's what they want to know. All this evil, why didn't God intervene? But do you see the inconsistency here? They say God must not exist since he doesn't intervene to stop wicked people. But then, when we show an example of when he does intervene in history and punishes wicked people, they call him a moral monster, right? The atheist can't have it both ways. On the one hand, the atheist will complain about God because he doesn't intervene and stop all the evil in the world. On the other hand, he complains about God because he intervenes to stop some evil in the world. Can't have your cake and eat it too. All right, but of course, they might respond by saying the punishment was too harsh. The punishment was just too harsh. I could see why he would punish guilty adults, but what about children? Why did children have to die? What about the animal? Everything that breathes? Isn't this an overreaction? Doesn't this seem a little extreme? Well, I want to say a couple things about this. To properly understand these tough passages about destroying the Canaanites completely, we need to understand the type of literature and literary devices that are being used. I believe that the Bible is literally true, but I don't think everything is expressed in the Bible in a literal way. The Bible contains metaphors like Jesus says, I am the door, okay? He wasn't saying he was made of wood. The Bible also uses hyperbole. For example, Paul says, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed where? In all creation under heaven. So this would be kind of hyperbolic, an exaggeration for effect. In fact, he says in Romans that your faith is proclaimed in all the world, okay? And so he's exaggerating to make a statement, an effect. Well, it could be the case, and I could be wrong, but it could be the case that hyperbole is being used in verses like Deuteronomy 7 and other passages that we've looked at that speak of totally destroying the Canaanites. Let's just look at Deuteronomy 7, 1-5 again. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you're entering to take possession of it and clears, again, here's this word, clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mighty than you, and when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. So it's completely wiping them out, annihilate them, this kind of idea. You must make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. But then we go to the very next sentence, and this seems a little odd. He says, you shall not intermarry with them. Okay, completely destroy them, but also don't intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons and taking their daughters for your sons, for they will turn away your sons from following me. To serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will destroy you quickly. And it goes on from there. Now this is a little strange. Notice, after commanding the Canaanites to be completely destroyed, the very next command is to not intermarry with them. Does that seem a little odd to anyone? How can you intermarry with people that have been completely wiped out? Now, I think this is because the actual intent of these commands was more to drive the people out of the land than to wipe out the Canaanites completely, every man, woman, and child. In fact, the dominant language in Scripture is not of extermination. It's actually driving out or thrusting out the Canaanites. In fact, someone did a word study, and for every time it says wipe them out, there's 3 times as many statements that say drive them out. Think about this. If you state that you had driven out an intruder that was in your house, well, no one would assume that the intruder is dead in your living room, right? Well, in the same way, if you said that you killed the intruder, no one would think that you had driven them out. And so these two things seem to be at odds with each other. How do we reconcile this? How can there be commands to wipe them out, totally, completely, utterly destroy them, and then all these other passages that talk about driving them out? And so, those passages are numerous. Also, after passages say that people were utterly destroyed, it says, clear as day, they were utterly destroyed. The same group of people show up again later in the text, sometimes in the very same verse. Let me give you one example, Joshua 10:20. When Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished striking down with a great blow until they were wiped out, okay? That sounds like no survivors. Great blow, they're wiped out. It's the same. This is the kind of terminology. But then it goes on, in the very next sentence says, and when the remnant, speaking of survivors, in fact, the NIV calls them survivors, that remained with them had entered into their fortified cities. So there were some people who fled and went into these fortified cities. So in the same verse, you have people, it sounds like no one survived, utterly destroyed, wiped out, depends on what your translation says. In the next statement, we read about survivors. And just go through, if you read Joshua, you'll see all these groups of people wiped out, completely destroyed. They killed everything that breathed, and so on. And then you open and just read the first chapter of Judges, and you see that all of these people are still around, okay? And so I think there's something more going on here. This is, I think, hyperbolic language. In fact, we find it in many ancient Near Eastern cultures. Is this too soon? This may be too soon. But we do this all the time. We do. Sports headlines are notorious for this. The Toronto Raptors get annihilated by LeBron James and the Cavs. Of course, we know they weren't really annihilated, But that's how we talk about these kinds of things. They were destroyed. In the same way, in these kinds of battle, they would use this kind of battle wartime rhetoric that would be hyperbolic. And we know, not just in the Bible, but outside the Bible, where one culture just squeaked out a victory over another culture, well, when in the writing, it sounds like they utterly destroyed them, okay? Even though they barely won the war. Okay, but let's assume that that's false. Let's assume it's not hyperbolic. Let's assume that the commands were really to wipe out every man, woman, and child. Is there still a problem? Is it immoral for God to kill people? That's the question. Is it immoral for God to kill people? I think that we can agree that if God needed morally sufficient reasons for killing the Canaanites, well, he had them in abundance, right? He had them in abundance. However, if God is God, does he even need to justify his reasons for killing someone? Does God need to give a reason to build up or to tear down, to plant or to uproot? That's what Jeremiah asks. Does God need to answer for taking the life of any person, even an innocent life like a child? When Job lost everything dear to him, he did not rail against God. He worshiped God, saying, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." That's Job 1:21. Reflecting on the sovereignty of God, the Apostle Paul says, "Does not the potter have a right over the clay?" Romans 9:21. If this approach seems a little bit severe, let me make an observation. When people argue against capital punishment, they often will appeal to something like, well, capital punishment is wrong because man shouldn't play God. Some people will argue that way. Man shouldn't play God. Well, the same sensibility is often reflected when people argue against cloning, right? They'll say man shouldn't play God in creating. That's God's prerogative. Now, I don't think those arguments are necessarily good arguments. I think the morality of cloning and capital punishment probably need to be decided on other grounds. But still, I think the intuitions they trade on are sound. Making life and taking life are appropriate prerogatives for God. He has privileges that we do not. Though we shouldn't play God, certainly God can play God, right? So to speak. That's part of what it means when we say that God is sovereign. He's the maker. The maker has complete authority over everything that is made. Why? Because he actually made it. He owns it. He has the rightful ownership. And everything God created is his. And so whether it's the adult who has sinned against him, or even, and I know we don't like to think about this, and this is where it might not be as emotionally satisfying, but even the child, whether it was a Canaanite child who died quickly with a sword, or it's a child today who suffers from cancer for a long period of time and then dies. Either way, God is the giver and the taker of life. And so it's not immoral for God to kill people.